Welcome to the Grow Renaissance podcast. Let's nourish the world.
All right, welcome back to Pasture Prime Time with Neil, where we're exploring the roots and future of agriculture, one story, one conversation at a time. For those of you that haven't remembered, I'm your host, Neil, and today we're heading to the southern tip of the continent for a deep dive into the economic pulse of agriculture in Africa. Joining us today is Wandile Sihlobo, Chief Economist at the Agriculture Business Chamber of South Africa, also known as Agbiz. Wandile, it's a great privilege to have you here today, and I'm really looking forward to diving into some conversations about agriculture in South Africa, in the Pan-African countries, and the global market space at large. But maybe I will start with just passing the mic over to you and having you share a little bit of your journey and where you've ended up in your career within the agriculture market space.
Yeah, no, Neil, thank you so very much for having me in this conversation. And certainly a conversation that I think it's important to have with regards to Africa's agriculture, because in the African continent, this is not just any other sector of the economy. It makes a great part of the African economies. You find that for many countries, with the exception of South Africa, agriculture makes up especially in sub-Saharan Africa region, makes up about 20% on average or so of the GDP, their jobs and everything else that goes with it. So looking closely on the sector, especially with an eye of saying how do you improve the farm productivity, is something that usually has a bigger spin-offs for the growth, employment and food security. But I mean, from where I'm sitting, which is in South Africa, we are a slightly different touch than much of the African continent, particularly sub-Saharan Africa region. Because South Africa's agriculture is largely commercial, a large scale. It's not that different when you're walking in a farm in central South Africa than what you will find in Australia, in New Zealand, Canada, the US. It's the same level of technological advancements that you see. But also when you consider the productivity levels, it's somewhat closer to there. And one of the key benefits of that is the technology adoption that South Africa has access to from some of these developed markets that we are utilizing. But of course, it's not a uniform story, because South Africa is a complicated country with a complicated history, where I know that some people in the global audience sometimes hear one part of the story, but it has a lot of nuances, because while it has that element of thriving agriculture, it also is an element of a smallholder farmers that are predominantly black farmers that are in this sector. And which is where then it brings in even a question you were asking about my journey in the sector. I mean, I come from a region in South Africa. We are in the southern tip of the African continent, but I'm even now, my ancestry in the far eastern region of South Africa, in a place called the Eastern Cape. That's in the southeast of South Africa. That's the province that we are in. That province is important because it actually signifies what South Africa is. It has a section that used to be the former homelands, where back in the day where we're still under the apartheid regime, and then it has a section which was part of the Union of South Africa. The former homeland is an area that was run by the tribal authorities in part, as well as the governments, the black governments that were given authority to those pieces of land. But the significance of it for this conversation is that the levels of development in those areas was different. The ones that were not part of Union of South Africa were less developed than the ones that were in South Africa. And if you look into the infrastructure today, it still mirrors that, even in terms of agriculture. The former homelands not as advanced as these ones, which is where I think my work in the sector is largely on. It's about how do we close the dualism that exists, but beyond that, thinking about the role agriculture can play in growing and developing and advancing rural South Africa, as well as, and of course, contributing to the bigger story. That's what I've been concerned with since I started entering this sector, thinking of it in terms of efficient markets as well as the dualism now.
Yeah, that's really well put, and I certainly champion that, some of the work that I do as well, in terms of how do we shore up the rural communities and really get them integrated into the larger picture. And it really is that balance. you wrote a fantastic book that I read, The Uncomfortable Truth About South Africa's
Yeah.
Agriculture. And to me, you struck a very unique balance between sober realism and pragmatic optimism, um, which I would like to ask you, which of the ideas or reforms you propose do you feel have gained the most traction since your publication?
Yeah. So on that work, Neil, that you're referring to, it was really a continuation of a conversation that has been underway. One
Okay.
begins with a conversation in a first book, which was called Finding Common Ground, Land Equity and Agriculture. And
Mm-hmm.
the idea at the time was born out of this conversation that we were having in South Africa about land reform. For people who don't
Mm.
know on why we are having land reform in South Africa, it dates back again to the history of apartheid in South Africa, as well as the equality of sharing of the land. And land reform in South Africa still today, since 1994, is happening under market-based principles on about three
Mm-hmm.
legs. You have a program which is called land redistribution, which talks to this equality opportunity for people to access land. You have land tenure, which is about affirming ownership, title deeds, so that people can invest in the pieces of land, strengthening property rights. And then you have land restitution. The people who are dispossessed in certain pieces of land, they can claim that back as part and parcel of the bigger reconstruction of South Africa as we go forward. The core argument on that book was saying, look, we can have land reform, but let's have it in a market friendly and a sustainable way, because at the end of the day, we have a history that none of us is proud of, but
Mm-hmm.
then we have a future to build. And that future needs to balance two things under your land reform. It is restorative
Yeah.
justice and
Yeah.
economic growth of
Yeah.
delivering the jobs. And one of the ideas then at the time, to your point about what ideas have actually come out of that, was that there's an amount of land that the South African government has already bought, which is about 2.5 million hectares of land. For someone who doesn't know how big that is in South Africa, yes, we are a big country. We are about 122 million hectares of land.
Mm.
But the area that we can actually farm, Neil, for crops and horticulture that is arable is only about 15% of that. The rest, you see a lot of
Oh, wow.
mountains and livestock
Yeah.
and stuff. So the 2.5 million hectares of land, if you think about how much we plant grains and oilseeds in the summer rainfall area, we plant them only in about 4.5 million hectares. So 2.5 is more than half of that. That's where
Mm.
one of the ideas that was in the book of saying, if we want to close dualism and making sure that there's equal participation of many people as we can, not necessarily in numbers, but a sense of inclusiveness, let's release that land with title deeds. But there were also
Mm.
some of the policies that are around trade, of saying let's open as many export markets as we can, which we haven't really been there. But lastly,
Right.
amongst many things that are there now is the technological aspects, which I think is
Mm.
so relevant for us now. Technology in two
Yeah.
ways: biological, as well as the IT and mechanical stuff. On the
Yeah.
biological side, we are struggling, as you and I are speaking, with animal diseases in South Africa: foot and mouth disease, avian influenza, at the
Mm.
end of June is one of the things that we just got an outbreak of. The core thing then is
Mm.
about how do we come up with a regulation where people can register vaccines as fast as we can, but also we can
Yeah.
invest more on vaccine development. And then there's another IT and the mechanical side of technology. Those are among some of the things that the book deals with, all at the core of saying, let's grow this sector. There's still capacity to expand it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm sorry to hear about some of those outbreaks. I mean, we're hearing some trends like that globally. Certainly, the avian flu is catching on, and screwworm and the red beef
Mm.
over in North America. So it's unfortunate, something we deal with. On the other side of the fence, I mean, we've got vaccines and biologicals that we speak about a lot, and getting those things registered and providing the mechanisms for producers, farmers, to combat some of these issues. On the other side of the fence, we have the mindset of regenerative agriculture, and I'd love
Mm.
your take on what that looks like, because there is a view that we shouldn't be focusing on the biologicals or those vaccinations. We should be really regenerating the lands and allowing nature to sort of deal with some of these outbreaks and components that we as humans have brought forth into our ecosystems. But uh, yeah, I'd love your take on and what does that word
I think
regenerative look
Neil,
like?
for me, Neil, there is no zero sum game on this. I think the regenerative agricultural path is what we are going to. And we have then to say, how do we move from the practices that we have
Yeah,
towards regenerative, but also just even beyond or aside from
yeah,
regenerative, on environmentally friendly practices. Because at the end of the day, we have to ensure that the land that we till, the land that we utilize, will still be here for other generations to come, but also we don't mess up the environment that we are in. Which means then
yeah.
that in applying agrochemicals or whatever that you are doing, you can use those on resolving the real near-term problem, but you have to have a mindset of saying, where is the source of these and how do we
Hmm.
continuously lessen this? Because if you are a farmer, the less you use any of these inputs, the better you save on the production cost, but also the more
Yeah.
you come up with a certain product which the consumers want. But I think, Neil, where the problem happens is that in activism, as well as in our enthusiasm and urgency to see the world changing, we
Mm.
sometimes think of it as a cut-off stop where we can say, stop everything, let's quickly
Hmm.
change and move in this way. But the reality is that
Hmm.
these are families that are farming. There's tomorrow. As long as we come up with a plan which sustainably shifts us towards the better path, and then it's well sequenced, that for
Yeah.
me is what I would support. And I'll tell you what, in South Africa, for example, we have been applying various methods of how we deal with these challenges for some time, because we are a country that is dependent on imports of a number of agricultural inputs.
Great.
In
Hmm.
our 2 million tons of fertilizer that the country currently needs, we import 80% of that. If we could
Oh
come up
wow.
with sustainably better ways of reducing fertilizer usage, that helps. In
Hmm.
agrochemicals that deal with all of the crop diseases, we import 98% of that. If we can
Hmm.
ensure that our ecosystem has improved, we reduce that. That's a win. And many other of these aspects. So, what the farmers have began doing, we started off with no-till farming in large-scale grain and the other areas so that the soil disturbance and the soil structure and the profile is something that we take care of. In medium
Great.
and small scale farming spaces, you can begin then to really move aggressively towards regenerative agriculture.
Yes.
But in some areas where you are doing the large scale grain farming and all of that, it becomes complex to deal with this, which is
Hmm.
where then you have to think to say, what are some of the climate smart agricultural practices where we can lessen also some of the inputs that are harmful for the environment and the soil structure, while then at the same time we are moving. I would say, Neil, this is a long way, but I would say we need a coordinated approach of all methods that work. But the one thing that we need to get out of our minds is that we want to change all of the practices tomorrow, because once that
Hmm.
happens,
Hmm.
the growers and the farmers themselves, they will tell you to go away and get out of their fields if you're telling them to
Yeah.
change all of their practices
Yeah.
tomorrow. No.
Yeah. Isn't that the truth? Yeah, I really like that. Coordinated approach is certainly what's needed there, and it's got to be messy. I always say ecology is messy, and so this transition that we're having is meant to be a little bit messy. One of the things that comes up often is funding, and we speak about smallholder farms and rural areas. Maybe you could speak a little bit to some of the constraints and maybe some of the resistance around funding in these areas, in these rural or smallhold farm market spaces within South Africa.
I mean, I think that the South African agricultural sector is generally capital intensive.
Hmm.
Depending on where people are, they'll use different currencies. But if you think of it from a South African rand perspective, our currency,
Hmm.
we have a farm debt at this moment of around 225 billion rands. And the
Hmm.
South African farm debt is growing at about 9% each year on average. So, as
Hmm.
much as the farmers are getting better prices, getting products out, they are not necessarily getting wealthy because, in part, of some of these inputs, components, and the
Hmm.
funding issue. And just because then we are also a semi arid country, you are dependent on a lot of creativity and the funding and technology in order to be able to make something out of this land. But that
Right.
also then means that if you're in a medium scale or small scale, the funding becomes a challenge at the moment. And some of the constraints are caused by the domestic policies, the lack of
Right.
clarity on land governance for smallholder farmers.
Yeah.
Some of the pieces of land that the government owns is not passing on the title deeds. That becomes a
Right.
constraint to small farmers. But I do think that there can be a better way of easing up funding for all farmers now, as the financial institutions are beginning to think critically about the ESG. I know in this new climate of today, people don't want to talk about environmental stuff and
Mm-hmm.
policies, but the reality is that this is environmental policies were never a political stuff. You can make them political, but the reality is there. There are constraints, there are difficulties, there are natural disasters, and we
Yeah.
have to figure out a way of how do we navigate that environment and improve the spaces that we inhabit. And this is where then
Yeah.
where I'm still thinking that moving towards and strongly with the climate smart agricultural practices, which the financial institutions recognize, and then they begin putting some incentives to nudge the farmers towards that, but also to ease up their burden. Those are things that
Yeah.
we have seen working. Certainly, especially on our side, when farmers were moving on and using more solar system in terms of energy usage,
Mm-hmm.
thinking critically about how much water they use and conserving a bit of water, thinking about critically about their carbon footprint. Those are all things that are good for environment, but also ease up costs. And we have been seeing that in our wine production regions of South Africa, in the fruit
Right.
production region, and even in
Yeah.
livestock. People are beginning to think about what to do there to limit some of the environmental side, and there's a financial incentive that comes with it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great to hear. Particularly in the livestock, that's an area that I am really fond of. And there's a lot of work going into just how we feed our livestock and the
Mm.
reduction of water that is needed when we're, you know, working the land in a different way and creating different management systems around that. So that is great. You spoke a little bit about markets, expanding the market opportunities. Are you seeing potential in South Africa to reach different global market spaces that you hadn't seen in the past? Maybe you could speak a little bit to some of that scenario going on.
I mean, Mike, we are talking now. Sorry, Neil. We are talking now. You are sitting in Canada, Neil,
Yes.
and Canada is one of the markets we are very interested in entering, especially as your southern
Fantastic.
neighbor is beginning to give us some
Yes.
friction with our products. No, South Africa has what we call an export-oriented agricultural sector. And of
Hmm.
course, we're not talking big numbers like what you see in the US, in Australia, and yourselves. Our exports, for example, in 2024 were just under 14 billion US dollars. And if you
All
think
right.
about the geography as to where
Yeah.
these exports go to, we have about 45% of the products going to the African continent, 19% to the EU, 25% it's the Middle East and Asia. We have the
Mm-hmm.
Americas, which is then Mexico, Canada, the US, about 6%
Mm-hmm.
of our products. The US specifically about 4%. And then Canada just a few notches above 1%, which is the area that we are looking at expanding, especially for our grapes, for our citrus, and a lot of our wine. That's the space that we are looking at and expanding to within Canada. Even before the U.S. difficulties, but he was just seeing the seasonality advantage that we have.
Right.
We're in the southern hemisphere, northern hemisphere, and when we have fruits, you don't have them. When you have
Mm-hmm.
something, we don't have it. So that there's a lot of that. But the other challenge that has happened in South Africa is that we have had a lot of farmers expanding the area that they plant to trees or for fruit, and all of that, to an extent that our estimates suggest that in the next 5 years, we will have the volume of fruit coming out of South African farms increasing by plus 30%. These are avocados,
Wow.
citrus,
Wow.
apples, pears, grapes, and we are looking for a place to say, where will all of this go? That's where then the conversation about looking at Canada, looking at
Yeah.
China, looking at expanding in India within the BRICS
Mm-hmm.
countries, as well as Saudi Arabia. That's the markets
Mm-hmm.
that we want to expand. And the reason we decided to expand on fruit and vegetables was not just that, the global consumer wants healthy stuff. It was also because these are the crops that are labor intensive in South Africa.
Hmm.
And we have certain South
Hmm.
Africans that can still be absorbed in some of these jobs as the wages have gotten better over time domestically. So that was the motivation on that. And if you then pair in the land that I mentioned earlier of just under 3 million hectares that can still be planted, that gives you a sense about how much land South Africa has and how much to come out of our fields. But then that produce needs export markets. Where we are
Yeah.
targeting now for our expansion is India, China,
Okay.
Saudi Arabia, with the
Yeah.
as well as Egypt within BRICS. But then thinking up north is Canada, as I've mentioned, but also retaining the EU and the UK market, which is so important for our fruits, and
Yes.
resolving the difficulties we have with the US. Because I said that the US accounts for about 4% of our agricultural products, but they are concentrated in a few commodities and a few regions in South Africa. There's an area of
Hmm.
South Africa which is called Western Cape. That's where Cape Town
Hmm.
is. Majority of our fruits from that province go to the US, just the proximity of where it's located, as well as another province of South Africa in the northeastern regions of the country called Mpumalanga and KwaZulu Natal. Those provinces
Hmm.
also participate in the US, mainly nuts, citrus, and table grapes and wine. So that's the thinking about the exports. But exports on their own, they make up about half of our volume that we produce. So
Okay.
it's such an important component for us.
Huge, huge. Well, I certainly, I'd love to pick up that thread with anyone that's interested in coming into Canada, export. Certainly have some connections there. So keep my number and email on hand. Love to see
Absolutely.
more South African products floating around on our shelves up here. Um, maybe we could turn the page a little bit and talk about some of the emerging technology. We spoke about biologicals, but the IT and technology components. Uh, there's a term that, and it's where I scratch my living. It's at the intersection of Web3 and agriculture. Blockchain and this ability to use data in a trustworthy way. Is that something that has crossed your desk in the research that you're doing? Data being used against farmers, data sovereignty for farmers and growers, how that provides maybe an added value on the ESG or scope reporting that's needed on the international market space. I'd love to hear a little bit more because I don't
Mm.
hear enough of what's going on in South Africa on that end.
I mean, I think that's the area, Neil, that we haven't actually explored a lot because what we are beginning to see on our side is that
Hmm.
if you're about to export products to Canada, the point that you will get, Neil, is that the traceability of that product is something that becomes important. So the
Hmm.
utilization of blockchain and any other technologies in terms of the traceability of the food, fiber, and the beverages product is a one part of it. The other aspect, of course, is around the payments and all of those things. It's another aspect that we have to think about it. But also the
Yeah.
sharing of that data, which is linked to my first point about traceability, the farmers' own data that they gather as to how that is managed, the governance, the sharing of it with the markets, with those that we are exporting to. But I
Yeah.
would say also with the input suppliers and the others that are trying to understand what that environment looks like. The conversation that I anticipate that in South Africa will have, perhaps maybe Canada, US, Australia, and the others are way ahead of us on this. It's around that exactly the point, the data governance, but also the aspect around of saying, what information and what tools should we be using a lot. And I would say in South Africa, probably much of these are available, but and many people are utilizing, but utilizing them in a fragmented approach, which is where
Yes.
we haven't really thought coherently about extracting the value out of this. And I guess the conversation could be led more from farmers associations and people that are on the ground affected,
Hmm.
or it could be led from financiers beginning to
Hmm.
think about this because much of the insight that they want to extract. But then if it's done by the financiers, the issue of the data governance and the others begins to be part and parcel of that question. But the one aspect I will close with on this is that from me reading and looking at all of these aspects, what I see them doing is really assisting us in improving the efficiencies of what we are doing. Both the feedback loop that you get from what
Yeah.
is analyzed and observed from you, but also the efficiencies of you when you are interacting with the buyers and the traders on those aspects. But it's all about, we have to think about the governance, we have to think about the tools that are used,
Hmm.
and we have to think about how then that is shared with various trading partners that we have. And that's the conversation that I think in South Africa we are yet to have at a comprehensive level.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking to explore those conversations even further as we start to think about bringing the grow technology into South Africa, and in really finding the right people to start those conversations with, and start turning the page, as it were, in terms of a new chapter and emerging technology that continues to shore up that rural community, but really integrate
Mm.
an ability for everyone to have a piece of that pie, right? Not regulators, not financiers, but one tide raising all ships, as it were, and having all the growers and producers being part of that story and that conversation as new policies get developed, new markets get opened, new contracts get ingrained, and then how we continue to funnel the funds in a more efficient way back to those that need it in all areas across the country. So, yeah, looking forward to that. I, I'm very curious, and I ask this of all the guests that I speak to. What are some of the top things that you think are going really well right now? We focus a lot on the things that aren't going well because, of course, those hit us in the face, and we can find gaps and deltas and how to improve them. But what are some of the great things that are going well in the South African agriculture market space?
We have a lot to be proud of. I mean,
Great.
I typically look in the sector. People tell us that, oh, you read on the media, there's all of these horrible things happening in rural South Africa and all of that, which is
Hmm.
a total misinformation in large part.
Yeah.
But looking at our sector from a prism of the new world of South Africa, 1994 to today, which is when the country gains independence or freedom or democracy, the value of agriculture is more than doubled and the volume over that time, which speaks to the productivity gains that we see. And there are two catalysts behind that. One aspect is, of
Hmm.
course, improving farm productivity. These technologies, biological, mechanical, they've driven that. The second catalyst has been the opening up of export markets and that demand pool, integrating the South African farmers into the world market. To an extent that
Hmm.
today, South Africa is the only African country in the top 40 global agriculture exporters. In 2024, we're ranked at number 32. So if you have an output more than double, now you are sitting as the only African country in the top 40 global agriculture exporter and you are progressively increasing. That's a win. In terms of employment, you would have thought that with all of the technology, jobs have gotten scarce. But we've actually seen a scenario where the sector and its value chain employs more people now compared to 1994. It's a second aspect. And the third aspect would be for me that if you think about food security, at a national level, we are food secure. Yes, there are people that are hungry, but it's more of an income poverty problem. Not that the country
Hmm.
can't produce enough to be able to feed itself. It's also, for me, another big win on that. There are, of course, areas of improvement that will be made. For example,
Right.
increasing the black farmer participation, because black farmers are still a small core heart of
Right.
South Africa. They make up roughly 10% on average of the commercial output. But the
Oh,
core
wow. Okay.
issue then is to say, to increase the black farmer participation, we have to think
Yeah.
about transformation and integration, not a zero sum game taken from a white farmer to a black farmer, but rather saying, how do we grow the agricultural pie and ensure that there's this coexistence for the good of the South Africa in agriculture, because we do have land that we can operate on. When I think
What
about
do you
that,
think?
and the other one is now a non economical part, Neil, more about the spirit of the South African
Mm.
farmers. You can hear the politicians, but if you drive across the country in South Africa, either you are meeting an English farmer, an Afrikaner farmer, a Zulu farmer, a Xhosa farmer. If you talk to them, people care about building a united country and collaborating and working together. The message of the politician is usually disconnected from the core
Mm.
idea, because farmers, they care about sharing information and knowledge and thereafter
Mm.
building capabilities from there. Those are things for
Yeah.
me that keep me quite uplifted when I look at these things, even if on a policy side and on a political side, things seems to be a friction. I always know that there's a lot we can be proud of, and there's a lot more that will come.
That's amazing. I really want to carry that message forward of that united front, and I was going to ask, and you actually answered it. Is that knowledge sharing, between all farmers of all races? What we can do to really accelerate that knowledge share, and also create new mechanisms, new levers that we can push on because of that knowledge sharing. Whether that's practices, whether that is equipment, whether that is integration of grain and livestock, so mixed operations, creating different enterprises off of a farm. One of the things I didn't realize that you had such an ability to feed the whole nation with the production that you have currently. It's certainly a missed story that I think is so key, because we hear about food resiliency in every bioregion around the world, and there's certainly a lot of even first world countries that don't meet that mark. They can't feed their population, and that's why export and trade is so important. So it's wonderful to hear that. How do we get that message more present and visible in the market space, even just within South Africa? What are some of the gaps there that are preventing that message to be heard?
I think, Neil, one of the things that we really have to focus on, which is why I worry sometimes that the dominance of negative news and sometimes incorrect statements about the representation of South Africa, they sip away the optimism. And you almost closer to getting into this space where people are no longer as enthusiastic about tomorrow, and misunderstanding some of the successes that we are making, which is why I think it's important to celebrate and see some of these key successes and say, okay, what progress are we making? And also, what are some of the key things that we could still achieve, the milestones, and what's the path to that? And the crazy thing about South Africa is that even the path ahead, we have actually already crafted it. We have something in the country which is called the Agriculture and Agro-Processing Master Plan. It is a development plan of saying, how do we inclusively build agriculture from where we are? And it's not a plan that was done by the government. It was co-created. In the table, we had government, we had business, we had labor, we had community, and all of these social partners sitting around the table and saying, okay, all of these pillars, if you are sitting on as labor, what do you deem as the better practices, and how do we realistically go forward? What can you put on the table? If you are in business, what are some of those things? If you are a regulator, what are some of the, as communities, who are then in a space where the aspects of environment, the aspects of social cohesion is part and parcel of what space do you want to see? And we ended up tailoring a plan and crafting it that I think it can work. What is left now is for us to have the courage of implementing it. And I think for us to implement, it is necessary that we share the positive stories of what we have achieved so far. And they have to make the point clear that look at what we can still do if we move forward. And that, for me, I think conversations like, for example, what we are having at Pasture Prime Time are part and parcel of carrying forward both the difficult conversations as well as encouraging and enlightening conversations about what we can have. Because I think this is a place, in a one way or another, yes, you have your own objective, but this is a space of reflections for the betterment. And I think this platform, it provides that space and a community for reflection and thinking about the future.
Absolutely. I love that. And for the audience that's listening right now, please comment in the comment section about some of your thoughts around agriculture in South Africa, how we can carry this message forward using the Grow platform to continue to amplify the scenarios. And if you're sitting somewhere in Canada or some of those trade markets that Wandile has talked about, please, comment, how you can engage with the South African agriculture market space in a way that is meaningful. And I'm sure we can put people in touch with the right people for ensuring that new contracts, new opportunities continue to surface. What are some of the what are some of the things that you would love our audience, global audience, to know that are happening today within the maybe within your region that you're sitting in right now, or even the country as a whole, beyond the things that you're proud of? Are there events? Are there upcoming policy discussions? Are there uh, new land reforms or new positive expansions going on? What are some of the current things that you would really like our audience to learn about or know about?
One of the things that I'm worried about at this moment, Neil, is the broader sub-Saharan Africa region food
Oh, okay.
security conditions. Everyone knows the figures that as the African continent at this moment will remain net importers of food. We spend 80 billion US dollars each year importing food, but the sub-Saharan Africa region
Mm,
about 45 billion US dollars importing food each year. But of
mm,
course, the difficulty with that question is not to say block imports. Imports and trade is something that must always happen, but it's also the fact that we have so much capacity at which we can actually be able to not only produce for ourselves, but produce so much so that areas somewhere in Asia, somewhere in Latin America, they can also be able to get the products coming out of the African continent. What
yeah.
distorts our agriculture is not so much an outside hand, but we also have a problem within as the African
Mm,
continent. Because if you take away South Africa and to a certain extent Zambia, as well as the Maghreb region, that's your Egypt, Tunisia, and the others, you look across on all of the other countries, there's a lot of a government policy reforms that as Africans we need to look at and decide about what to do on that. And for a
right.
moment, we had a situation where a number of donors, whenever we had a bit of a difficulty, either environmental disaster, droughts, and all of those things, the donor funding would kick in and support communities to a certain extent. The World
Right.
Food Program is one of those. But what we don't talk a lot is about how much of the World Food Program budget is actually coming from USAID. If now USAID in
Yes.
the US is no longer providing that funding, we are left in a situation where food security is at risk if we are hit by any drought. Then that brings
Hmm.
the point then to say, what can the African governments do for themselves? And I think for me, one of the things that we need to reflect on with greater clarity and urgency as Africa is to say, one, we need to strengthen land governance. I talked about the title
Yeah.
deeds questions in South Africa, but that title deed question applies across the sub-Saharan Africa region. If you look at the rural
Okay.
land in sub-Saharan Africa region and you extract South Africa out, you look at all of the other countries without South Africa, you realize that
Yeah.
90% of all of the rural land is actually informal. There's no title deed. We can't then hope for serious funding to come in to develop
Right.
farms that can actually be sustainably producing
Hmm.
on that. So we need to improve land governance. The second aspect for me is around the infrastructure, public infrastructure, roads, railway lines, electricity, water. These are things we have to plan for the long term on how we improve. Because if you think about regional value chains, these value chains are not going to operate efficiently without that infrastructure being there. And quickly, I would add there and say aspects around the government policy approach to markets also matter. We have a scenario where African governments like intervening in the markets, and sometimes it's understandable. When there's a drought and
Yeah.
grain prices are increasing, as an example, they'll come in and say, we are putting a cap at this percentage. We don't want the prices going more than this. But what we forget is that we are taking away the incentive from the farmers to
Yeah.
expand production. We have a saying in South Africa where we say the cure for higher prices is higher prices. It encourages that for the next season.
Yeah.
And I think that we
Yeah.
need to practice a little bit of a restraint to markets and think about this in terms of the long term. And the last thing I would add there, Neil, is that I am of the view that we should be open and supporting all typologies of farmers: large scale, almost industrial, large commercial farming, medium scale, family farms, and small scale farming, because all of them play an important role. The large scale ones are the ones that are responsible for the mass grains and the other cereals that we need and need for supporting the cities because the population is urbanizing. then others play another role in the value chain. But in Africa, there's been this conversation of almost saying everybody must go rush and be a smallholder farmer. Smallholder farming is
Mm,
great, but small is maybe beautiful, but it's not always helpful in terms of the scale.
yeah.
So for me, I would say let's embrace large scale farming in Africa in the same energy that we are embracing small scale farming. And I think that that's the discussion that even now the global audience that does interact with the African continent. We need not to be thinking about this continent in a way of saying it's for smallholder farming, it's for this, but rather it's about how do we embrace all typologies. But the African governments have to take charge into this. It can't be only a blame game of an outsider. There's a lot that we can
Yeah.
do ourselves.
I love that. And I really encourage that conversation to continue forward and champion, the message that you're bringing there. I have long held the belief that it really doesn't matter about land size. We really need to understand the carrying capacity of the land. So, if you have 10 acres, what is the poundage that you can get out of there, and how many different enterprises can you have, you know, um, proteins that you're growing? Can you have grains? Can you have fruit? 100 acres, 100,000 acres. Do we know what that carrying capacity is? I was working with a farm that is producing 100 million pounds. Sorry, a million pounds, not 100 million pounds. A million pounds of produce coming off of 100 acres, and we said, could we take that to 2 million? Do we know what that capacity endpoint is? And we don't, and we just haven't got there with our systems. And so, to your point, and I think this would be so valuable for South Africa, but the Pan-African countries as a whole, really better understanding the capacity of the land sizes that the farmers are working on, because then you can start to create a system that is integrated through all the different sizes to meet the needs of export, internal trade, and food resiliency all over. And that applies in all regions around the world. That I would say the same message. I certainly promote that heavily in Canada. We're big grain farmers in the prairies of Canada, which is where my family farm is located. And I continue to say we don't need more land per one farmer to stay, liquid. We need to better understand how to maximize the carrying capacity of that land. And that changes the perspective, right? And it changes
Though, Neil, to the point that you're making, what has troubled me most, there's work done by Professor Tom Jane and his colleagues at Michigan State University. They were looking at the expansion of grain production in the African continent from the early 2000s up to the 2020s. What they found was that, with the exception of South Africa, Zambia, much of the expansion of the expansion in output was due to farmers tilling more area rather than improving the yield and utilizing that land and understanding the soil and understanding what's needed in order to get more. Which is where, then, for me, I always think that the conversations about how we better understand our soil, improve productivity of the farms, is so useful, because now if you don't do that and you go around cutting all the trees around you so that you can get as much grain as you can, and you are getting a 1 ton per hectare, 2 ton per hectare there, while if you understood the soil structure that you are operating in, you could be at 14 tons per hectare or whatever that you can get. Those are the conversations that I think are important, as much as we are talking about agricultural development, but then we bring the know-how, the scientific aspect of saying, let's look at this. How can we optimize it?
And I think that's the missing link, because there's so much research and so many subject matter experts out there on how to improve soil and integration of agroforestry, so keeping the trees, and farming under solar panels, agrivoltaics, and the benefits. But the missing gap, and this is where I play a role, and this is what I do, outside of having great conversations like this, is boots on the ground, implementing those designs, and actually observing what's working in your area versus somewhere up in Durban, Umhlanga area. It's different, and yet it's the same drivers. We could be talking about the same drivers, but different soil types, different profiles, different tree types. But we need that implementation knowledge, and that is the missing key to helping farmers really understand what they need to do to improve their capacity on the land that they currently own. And also the multi-species that you can grow there, right? We're so ingrained that if we're growing wheat or maize, that's what we should be doing. And we
Yes,
forget that
yes.
we could be growing multiple different crops and having multiple different harvests, and we could be doing so much more to increase those enterprises or those opportunities to have multiple different balance sheet improvement financial mechanisms from
But
your
but
farm.
this is where then the knowledge infrastructure, either you
Yes.
are on Pasture Prime Time or other platforms, which is where I think the knowledge infrastructure that empowers the
Yeah.
farmers in their decision making, in their thinking about these area, is so necessary for that conversation. Because for me, I'm not always sure of how much of what we are researching end up on that application of that. And part and
That's right.
parcel of that missing link may be the communication aspect. It may be, of course, then the showcasing of how those things are implemented, and sharing the observations and the results of what you get. Because most farmers and the growers that you meet, they are all in the idea of saying conserving the resources they have, but also thinking about how do you optimize out of that. And I think that when there are interesting
Yeah.
things that are out there, very few people would resist applying those. And I think that's that part that needs to be ongoing in
Yeah.
thinking about these aspects.
And one of the things that struck me in and I know this is true in less affluent farming areas as much as it is in affluent farming regions, but farmers get scared around sharing information that's going to be used against them. And so they might be doing some terrific, they might take some research, they might apply it, it's working really well, but they don't want to tell people about that because the government or regulatory parties or somebody's going to come in and use that information against them. And I think that's where I'm so encouraged with something like blockchain, and not to over index
Yes.
technology, but it it allows for data sovereignty and that knowledge share
Mm,
without having to, you know, be fearful of that information being used
mm,
in different ways. And so we can actually start to have a mindset of open sourcing our own information. And so, if
yes.
you were my neighbor, I could share information in an open source platform like the blockchain so that we could
Yes.
better understand what I'm doing, what you're doing, and start to have that ripple effect all the way
Yes.
across the agriculture chain. And that's encouraging. That's what gets me fueled every day is how do we change those mindsets so we can take all that wonderful work that's happening in that research and then apply it
Yes.
and then take that knowledge share and move it down the chain. And so that's really, really exciting to hear that, there's an
Absolutely.
openness and a mindset, from your perspective, because I find sometimes economists, don't always have that pragmatic view like you do. And I'm really encouraged by that,
Thank you.
Wandile. Yeah.
No, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Because I think for me, of course, there are those technological aspects, but one of the old school ways at which in South Africa we still continue with is also these exchange programs where farmers visit various areas to go and learn
Yeah.
and see what works and what doesn't work. I mean, in our WIT program, we've been doing some of these with Australians where we go to
Yeah.
see what are they doing right and what can we do on this side. But then now with the technological capabilities that either brought
Yeah.
by blockchain or whatever platform that are in, those will assist on that, but also even within in country, because there are some of the other regions that you do well and be doing things differently than you can. And then there's a space to share that. But another fortunate thing that we have in South Africa is effective farmer associations where
Mm.
commodity groupings at a national level, and then they would
Mm.
have the sub provincial levels that are in. And in those structures, they are not just there for political and the policy side, but they have these working groups where each farmer shares about what they are doing. And it's a safe space because you know
Mm.
that you have with the best wheat producers in the country, with the best guava producers, with the best grape producers in the country. And then they focus exactly on those optimization of things. Then when we need the government to be involved, then the commodity association as a body will know what limitations and how to involve the government in those areas. We find that to be very useful to an extent that even for the new entrant farmers in the sector, young people wanting to get into farming, it's always advisable to say, register, think about the commodity you want to get involved in, and register to those
Yeah.
farmer associations and start attending those classes and knowing what's going on and what people are observing on the ground. and you are coming in
Yes.
maybe with the insight theoretically and some of the things that you are learning, you'll be able to test those ideas with the folks that are practitioners in there. And that for me is always amazing, because there you have farmers, you have scientists, you have academics, and many other people that all sits in those various working groups focused on the commodity specific aspects.
Yes, absolutely. And I also think, within those groups, and sometimes we have a narrow view in agriculture that other market spaces don't support us as effectively. But I look at the mining sector, and specifically in South Africa, how much benefit the mining sector can have in land reclamation, using tailings, as part of the fertility programs, or creating new products that are going to be bridge products to regeneration, and even utilization of equipment, that can be utilized in both agriculture and mining sectors. And so I think there's a lot more integration too
Mm,
in bringing in
mm,
outside agriculture market knowledge into how we can continue to propel positive traction and positive practices that are
mm.
meaningful for new and experienced practitioners and farmers.
Mm. No,
Yeah.
absolutely. Because at the end of the day, for me, then it's about, which is why I think even in a broader African continent, in addition to the points that I had mentioned, that what the governments
Hmm.
should be doing, I would even add this idea of the farmer associations that are also necessary. Because yes, you do talk about the hard infrastructure, but the soft knowledge infrastructure is something that is also needed, about how to organize all of these insights that are there for the good of the sector and increasing its productivity, and output in a way, while taking care of the environment that you are in. Because at the end of the day, you're still going to be in that farm next year and the year after. So you better take good care of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, listen, my friend, we're getting near the end of this podcast series here. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to some more conversations with you in the future here, and see where we've ended up, and some of the things that you're bringing to the market space, and some of the conversations. This publication is going to be live as of next week, and I highly encourage our whole audience, if you have questions for Wandile, reach out through the podcast in the comment section, or you can reach me, and I can make sure that the connection to Wandile is made for any further questions that anyone may have. And likewise, Wandile, I hope you continue to follow some of the things we're doing at Grow and Pasture Prime
Absolutely.
Time, and some of the conversations. And I'm really encouraged about what's going on in South Africa, and look to amplify that voice. More importantly, I'm looking forward to some guava and grapes in Canada pretty soon.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you so very much, Neil. I've enjoyed our
thank you.
conversation, and thanks for having me on.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Grow Renaissance podcast. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe this episode. Remember, it will take a community of us to do the best in the world and truly nourish not only ourselves, but the planet, the atmosphere, the soil, the plants, and the animals on it. So make sure you spread this message anywhere that you can.